Here we go. Welcome, everybody. This is our community call for March 14th, 2023. We still have a couple of people joining us today. Call topic today is collaboration with change agents, movement makers, and community-based organizations. We have a panel of speakers who are going to tell us a little bit about how they work together with the community to bridge those connections. We've had feedback from the community that you're wanting to lead more into connecting with issues of racial justice, of diversity, equity. You're wanting to make those connections in the community, and you're not necessarily knowing exactly how to do that. So hopefully these speakers that we have talking with us today can give us some insight into how they make those connections. And yeah, give us a roadmap or answer questions for how we can bring that all together for everyone. Oh, great. I've got a little to-do list here from Ben. He wants me to start with a centering practice, which I usually do with my facilitation for other small groups that I run. And I'd like to take you all for this centering practice to one of my favorite places. Let me share here. All right, so this is the shore of Lake Michigan. This is one of my favorite places to be. This is where I feel very centered, very grounded, watching the sun go down into the lake. So if we'd all like to take a moment to stand on the shore together, you can close your eyes if you want to, and breathe with me. Get settled in your seat and take a deep breath in. Slow breath out. Deep breath in. Slow breath out. As you're relaxing, imagine yourself standing on the shore of Lake Michigan, or any body of water that you like. Tap into your senses and really connect with how that feels, being connected to the earth, this place where all of the elements combine. How does that feel? You can imagine your feet in the sand, the waves on your toes, the sun and the wind on your skin. Breathe into that space. Open up to that sense of connection. Listen to the sound of the waves rolling in steady. The rhythm almost like a heartbeat. Feel that connection for just a moment. Sink into it. Enjoy it. Say thank you to the water and the land and the air for holding you. And then when you feel ready, take another deep breath in. Come back to center. Breathe in again. Wiggle your fingers and your toes. Maybe roll your shoulders. Stretch your neck or your arms. You need to shake it out. Shake it out. Get any of that excess energy out. And let's all come together into this space and have a productive discussion. Thank you all. So let's see, let's maybe introduce ourselves to each other a little bit. If you'd like to type in the chat, your name, where you're from, any little details about how you're feeling today, what you're interested in hearing from our presentations. Go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat real quick. We'll give you a minute or two to do that. Say hi. Hi, Sonia. Hi, Betsy. Sonia. Good to have you here. Robert. Eileen and Karen. Thank you. Anne and Kelly. Sarah. Jean. Alan. Aaron. Brooke. Great to have you all here. And if you didn't know, I am located in Lansing, Michigan. So if you take a look at my map right here, I'm right here today. That's where I'm calling you from. Right. Aina, good to have you here. Okay, so we're going to go into our speakers. We're going to start with Aine and then go to Alan, then Aaron, and I'll kind of lead you through. Aaron will go to Nancy and then Will and Brooke and Nassim if she's here. But yeah, just we're give us a little sense of the kind of work that you do, how you connect with organizations that can help bring change and move us forward in society. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say and any insight that you might have. The question that Ben has highlighted here is, what are you learning about building relationships, establishing partnerships, and or starting collaborative projects between retreat centers, movement groups, and community-based organizations? So, Aine, if you're ready to start us off and let us know a little bit about the work that you do, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm going first, so I'll just ask for your grace and generosity up front. My name is Aine Bailey, she, they pronouns. I'm located on ancestral unceded land of the Kusada and Muskogee people, which is colonially known as Alabama, about South Central Alabama. I'm the founder and co-executive director of New Seneca Village, and I'm going to shout out my co-executive director, Taina Jones, who is coming on full-time this week. Yay! So very pumped about that. So she'll be here listening as I share about the work that we've been doing over the past year and some change. So New Seneca Village is an emerging retreat space. We do not have our own retreat center, so we partner often with retreat spaces, but we're really focused on bringing together cis, trans, feminine, and non-binary women of color to be in residency together with an emphasis on restoration, connection, and visioning. So the goal is really to bring people to gorgeous land, which we consider an active healing partner, along with gorgeous food, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, is another active healing partner, but to bring women to retreat space to really be exploring what does it mean to be leaning into their being and not their doing. And so our residencies are very light on programming. We have opening circle and closing circle, which are mandatory. We also bring healers with us to provide restorative practices, offerings either group or individual. And so folks are encouraged to participate or not as they see fit. We also, as a team, host like visioning sessions, connecting sessions, and are really leaning into feedback from our community about what's most important to them. In particular, as we're serving folks who are working primarily in nonprofit or serving communities that are really about how are we advancing justice in the world? How are we in some way shifting our current paradigm into something new and different? And how can they source their leadership from restoration, connection, visioning, as opposed to extraction, competition, scarcity, which is all of what gets created by our philanthropic industrial complex and obviously bleeds down and into our nonprofits. And so we're really clear and about folks choosing, having agency and sovereignty to choose what it is they want to participate in. If you want to sleep the whole time, great. If you want to go to every single healer session, fine, perfect, right? And so really wanting folks to be able to tap into hearing that wise inner voice, and also whatever consciousness, higher consciousness, ancestors, tree community, nature community has to say about informing their leadership to sort of activate and hold and host it from a new space or a different space. I can share a bit more on how we think about partnering with our leaders. So we're really looking for leaders who are at a moment of leaning into their own restorative journeys, whatever that means. And we really see ourselves as providing a container within which that can happen, but not prescribing what that looks like. So we have 3 circle sessions in advance of being on the land together that just allows people to be in contemplation around their restorative practices and where they learned them, what communities gave them what messages, and then also what does their wise inner self have to say, as well as how to tend to the residency, attend to life so that the residency can tend to them, right? Like, I don't want you getting ready to take a nap on a sun-dappled field and you're like, oh shoot, I'm supposed to be in a call, or my grandma's garbage needs to go out and no one has done it. And then also a real section for our folks in particular around how do we give ourselves permission to be retreating and not doing and being, in particular for our communities that are so often looked at as doing. We need to be doing something, producing something, practicing value in some way as defined by, you know, the dominant culture. It's really important that we're able to give ourselves the permission to lean back and lean into other ways of knowing and doing that have nothing to do with doing anything. And then I'll close just to say that we are hopeful to have our own retreat center space, in large part because I've been blessed to go to many retreat spaces and they are not for us. From the pictures on the wall, or the shampoo and lotion that's available, or even being with lovely people, but there's sort of like the either too much interest or avoidance that happens when you're with others in space that have not been sort of primed to be with folks of color. And so we really look for partnering with sister centers who, we can afford to buy out the whole space. As part of what we're really leaning into is reducing the isms that these folks have to deal with, because that's generally their entire life and also their work. So that's enough work to do. So we're really leaning into partnering with centers that can reduce those isms as much as possible. We also ask that staff who don't need to be around aren't around, and have really had great partnership in being responsive to that request. And then also just folks who are aligned with the community that we're trying to support in the way that we're trying to support them. And so I will say, and this is a little plug, Taina, but we have worked with Would-Be Institute on the West Coast, and we are looking for East Coast folks because East Coast centers, because we're very West Coast dominant right now. And so I'll wrap there, and I know there's more to come during our question and answer, and happy to be in the conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ayin. Reverend Allen, did I see you pop in?
Hey y'all, you can call me Alan,
Okay.
but thanks for the reminder. I sometimes forget. Yeah, I'm Alan Maxfield Steele. I'm one of the co-directors at the Highlander Research and Education Center, or some folks just call us the Highlander Center or Highlander. We used to be called the Highlander Folk School, and the state of Tennessee took that name from us or legally took that name from us back in the 60s. So that's a different story. But we are a 90-year-old organization that has been has not been a retreat center, but functions in some ways as a space where folks can engage in retreat, so that people can do the work of grassroots organizing, leadership development, movement building together. I think the simplest way to describe what we have done over the 90 years is trying to apply learning and education methodologies to movement building, grassroots leadership, grassroots organizing, mostly in the Southeast, mostly in the Mountain South. East Tennessee is where we've always been. We've been in 3 different locations. But first and foremost, I think we're movement builders. And then secondly, we're folks who have a retreat center, if that makes any sense. So we have an asset, we have a set of buildings, we have places where people can sleep, we have a staff that helps to prepare meals and serve those meals and hold radical hospitality with folks. And it's a space where the movements of the US South and Central Appalachia and beyond can consider a home base for their conversations, for their learning, that we accompany sometimes directly, and that sometimes we go out in community and in residence in communities and have more of a non-place specific approach. But in fact, it's really place specific as we're going to people's communities because they've asked us to come there. So we're a little bit more of a both and around retreat and what that means than some of the maybe more traditional retreat center models or approaches. So some of the ways that we get at this is like, and questions that I think I have for a group that's asking these questions is like, well, what's the relationship that your center or your effort? Prescription medication that replaces pancreatic digestive enzymes. What's the relationship that your center or your organization has to local, area-based, statewide, regional, national, international movements for social change? Or is your center specifically designed to do that, or is it trying to build relationships? And what's the relationship that you're really trying to foster? Are you trying to foster a relationship that's like, come use our space? And so how do you make it available to those budgets, those efforts? How do you make it amenable? And then how do you maybe structure internally financial stuff, financial approaches and cost structures that, you know, ask a labor union that has a multi-million-dollar budget to pay more than a grassroots organization that has nothing, you know. So there are models that we can use, financial modeling, that enable us to do that. So we tend to think about it in those terms. We also think about different organizing cultures. Just like any identity, we can reduce ourselves based on our identities, or we can expand our understanding of who we are based on the plurality of our identities. I think that our movements have the same kind of reality, right? There's a lot of different organizing and movement cultures. There's a lot of different organizing traditions. Chicago-based community organizing has a lot of similarities to Southern and rural organizing, but there are a whole bunch of cities in the South. And people tend to forget that one of the largest ones in the United States is here, and it's one of the most racially diverse and speaks the most different languages in the country, and so we have a lot of different organizing traditions that come with being a very pluralistic part of the world. And then there's like organizing formations, movement building formations. Some people are more politically aligned than others. So is your institution trying to understand organizing at the local level through the plurality of formations that exist? And do you want to align yourself with one, more than one, a lot? Are you multi-ideological, that kind of stuff? I think a lot of those kinds of considerations are part of the invisible work that we try to help organizations and people visibilize as they think through partnerships and collaborations. I think the one common thing that's real for us is that we don't really bring the state or cops to our place, at least not intentionally. We make the joke sometimes that wherever 2 or more are gathered, there might be a Fed or somebody who's trying to understand what's going on. So we think about digital security and safety. We think about physical and community safety as a big part of what it means to create a home base for people who are trying to build movement with each other. Particularly, I'm one of the folks on our staff who thinks a lot about the integrity of our movements and how we have historically been under attack. And so what does it mean to create a space that accounts for all the different kinds of attacks from state or non-state actors that might want to disrupt the lowercase d democracy building work that we're trying to do. I think when people are like, who do you work with and why do you work with them? I'm like, yeah, we definitely have priorities, and some of that's historical in nature, some of it's geographical in nature. I think what's common about everybody is if you're down with the idea of expanding lowercase d democracy, and if you're someone who's been typically marginalized from that democracy building, or maybe is currently being, or maybe on the horizon you will be for whatever reason, we're going to work with you, or at least try to figure out how you're going to get support from us or someone that we know that could help you or work with you or support you. And then I think the other thing is real about Highlander, and this last thing I'll say is at our best, we are in a mutual relationship with the communities that we're in support of. And by that, I mean, again, at our best, our staff and our board and our is our constituency. Like I'm a former program participant. I come from working class rural communities in the Carolinas. We're majority Black and brown staff and board. Those are the communities that we're working with, majority queer. And I think that there's just, and mostly working class, I think I'm one of the only people who really identifies as like middle class upbringing. And my mom was a secretary, my dad was a social worker. They had 3 jobs apiece, right? So like, what does that mean? So like, we have those realities. So like our mutual accountability is about, as much as we are trying to shape the world that we're in, we're also being shaped by it. And I think that that disposition really those are part of the considerations that we have. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I went long. I don't know.
No, that was a lot of rich information, Alan. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Aaron, would you like to talk a little bit about the work that you do and let us know what you've got going on?
Yeah, I am the steward of the pattern for the Wild Seed Society. And the Wild Seed Society is an organization that thinks of itself at the intersection of movements for social transformation, spiritual liberation, and economic revolution. And our goal is to kind of bring those different movements into a more generative dialogue with each other and do the kinds of work that can only happen when those 3 movements are working together and resourcing each other. And we do that through probably too much disparate programming. I think we're in a place of like trying to figure out at least what our main programmers are that we can explain to other people so they get a sense of what we are. But in the past couple of years, we were in a very weird situation, like a lot of people were in 2020 coming out of the uprisings. And there was a really big disconnect between the amount of resources that rush into movements and the capacity. And adding resources doesn't always lead to additional capacity, as many folks know. And so we kind of we helped BLM chapters in the South deal with that influx and deal with the really intense security threats that were starting to become more, I would say, pronounced and resourced against Black liberation movements, post Trump, and that led to a gift from some BLM chapters to have some starting funds for us to build out a kind of more robust support system for movements, right? Oftentimes, a lot of BLM chapters did their most dynamic work without any staff at all, and ran massive mutual aid programs. And generally, how we think about scaling those things up is you get a consultant who comes in, you sign a contract, you pay them, they have very specific deliverables. But most of the dynamic groups I've seen don't have the ability to hire a consultant. Like that's kind of an absurd idea. There's not even someone who could sign the contract or a bank account that could reliably have the money to pay an invoice. And I think anybody who's really worked deeply with uprising groups, we're just weird people, right? Like uprisings make you think about things differently, do things differently. We were in Louisville for a while, and I'm sure people have seen the report that came out, which from my perspective is just the DOJ just co-signing like 70% of what Black people have been saying has been happening for years in Louisville. But if you weren't there, it is wild. Like I have friends in Louisville, and I was like, y'all lying. Because I was in DC and I was in Chicago, and those are two very notoriously ridiculous police departments. But you're just describing petty teenagers with guns doing things. And that like even that don't sound like a police department, even from my very abolitionist position. And being like, no, that's what they are. They're just not teenagers, they're grown men, and their guns are very large and their budget is larger. Um, and it leads to a different kind of life and a different kind of set of conditions and considerations. And for us, we saw a Black trans woman do an action that got national news. Trump Jr. Talks about that action, and from him talking and tweeting about it, somebody finds that Black woman's information, and her door is kicked in the next day, right? So someone goes to her house because they heard about the business she ran. She didn't know to figure out how you can register a business legally where they don't know your name and address. And so they found it within 24 hours, right? Which is a different kind of threat than we faced, right? It wasn't somebody who was prominent. It wasn't somebody who was on CNN. It was just Donald Trump Jr. like going through Twitter and finding, libs to whatever he feels like his stupid comments do. And so now we're kind of in this place of thinking about there was a real struggle for people in the movement, particularly women of color who often are doing triple duty, right? They usually have a job that's not 9 to 5. It's like some ridiculous amount of hours that's not really related to their BLM work. And then they're a community leader. And then they're often taking care of children and family. And they make decisions that are based on their individual genius, but also just long-standing relationships. There's no replacing them. There's no structure that you can build around them. All you can really do is, go in, clean their house, maybe watch the kids for a while, take their grandmother to dialysis to give them the space to make the decisions that only they can make. And so we've really focused on what new structures do we need to have to respond to this new terrain that people are facing, and what new infrastructure do we have to build for those women of color leaders to actually have places to go, to get that space, to make the decisions that they can make. And so we have been working with just doing a lot of landscaping and conversations with retreat centers. And after a really helpful conversation with Brooke at the Watershed Center, we're like, oh, I don't think we want to run a retreat center. I actually don't. I think that's a different job, and we need to find somebody willing to do that who wants to partner with us, where we can do the programming and do a lot of the safe space, and somebody who has the history and has the interest and has the personnel to run the retreat center. And so that those are kind of the conversations we've been having. And one thing I really just want to name is the difficulty between who has the land, as Ian was talking about, and who needs the land, both in terms of just distance and culture and race, but also just the movement is a weird space, and it has to be, because we face the brunt of US imperialism, and a lot of things that people in the movement face every day just feel are hard to explain. And so one of the things we've been struggling with is how to make those partnerships when it's just like, oh yeah, you can't, not only can you not call the cops, but like we need to figure out how cops aren't around here because people are going to be triggered. And you also need to realize that some people are going to sound paranoid because they're going through a mental health crisis, and that's why they need to retreat. But just because they're paranoid doesn't also mean that their ex wasn't an FBI agent and they're not constantly being followed by somebody who's trying to videotape them doing something. Like, both of those things coexist, and that's what makes it difficult, is they're paranoid because people are after them, but that stress over years actually they need to take a break where they don't think about anything. And they're not going to be not always going to be the ideal hosts. And so we're looking for retreat centers who we can partner with when people are going through crisis, so we can give them extended amounts of time to heal. But I'll stop there. Sorry, I know I went over. I timed myself because I was like, I'm going to talk so much, and then I still just blew past it.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Aaron. Nancy, what would you like to share with us today?
Wow, I just want to riff off everyone's been saying. Yeah, there's a lot here that's resonant. So I'm Nancy Lee. I'm a co-executive director at Tatamagouche Center. And we, similar intersections, I think, to Wild Seed and a little bit New Center, even Highlander. For us, it's spirit. We consider ourselves a spiritual and justice-oriented retreat center. We have a very strong focus on collective care and rest. So, and the point about land, we are in a historical moment. We're in a process of land back to the Mi'kmaq. And there's an organization of clan mothers that will be receiving that land. That's a longer story, but they have been in and with our community for decades. We've been in solidarity work. Land and water defenders is part of and food justice, I would say, are the movements that our center supports. And the elders, the grandmothers, clan mothers are definitely kind of central to that. But it's complicated by the fact that we are owned and originated by the United Church of Canada. So there's a great deal of harm that has been in repair and in writing relations for decades. And I mean, one of the reasons I joined the center is I feel like it's one of the organizations, not without its issues, but that's genuinely rolling up its sleeves on reconciliation, reparations, and right relations. And so we have quite diverse community of communities. The communities of African descent, including African Nova Scotians, Wabanaki, Indigenous communities across not just Mi'kmaq, our province, but across, what was formerly the territories that are under the peace and friendship treaties. And stop me to give me the little. But in terms of, we are in a process, like our focus is really healing our relationship to the earth. The clan mothers are very clear. We don't want to use the term land back. We use the term returning. We're in a return to right relationship to the earth, with each other, to ourselves. And the colonial capitalist system has divorced many of us from that. And certainly in the ways that we gather. And so the magic for us is gathering similar to New Seneca, with very little agenda, on the land, around food, around ceremony. We have a tension. We have a wide range of programming, and some of it is very, leadership skills with agenda and expertise. And some of it is peace and friendship gathering, around building a longhouse, and, very, very organic, and similarly elders, healers. So I feel like we're in a process of unlearning, and just really scaling back to what is most important. So one of the things in our relationship building for elders and healers, frontline workers, and especially racialized folks, has been an invitation to rest. Just rest, stay in your PJs, go to the ocean. We're right on 2 bodies of water. And so that has been actually, I don't know if you've seen Rest is Resistance, and I feel like there is something very powerful. We did that during COVID, simply because we couldn't gather. We hadn't done that in the past, but it has become a very powerful part of our programming. And I think that what you spoke to, Ian, about the just being, we've been talking a lot about that. And I feel like that is our direction. That is where much more where we want to be. We've just started the co-leadership and shared leadership. So we're trying to also look at how do our structures and systems and norms, how do we dismantle some of this that we're steeped in, toward a different way of being together. And a lot of that is also holding past harm. So part of what we're doing right now is a walking audio tour of our land and our spaces. It includes the elders who have ancestral and family ties to the land. It includes people from different racial and affinity groups. And we're simply sharing those stories and piecing them together. We're using our kitchen to talk about how tracing our roots through food, and so story and storytelling is a way that we connect, and also really render that past harm explicit and talk about it. Like, we haven't done enough of that. And that includes the church apologies and then the long, messy road to reconciliation that we're still in. And it includes things like we brought down a big 10-foot cross that was in what used to be called our chapel space. Now we call it sanctuary. And we turned it into all gender signs for our washrooms. Just like the everything from, the food that is culturally sensitive and welcoming, that radical welcome to the spaces, to the to our programming, and so I think I've shared it all, and I've probably gone over time. But
thank you so much, Nancy. All right, let's see. Will, would you like to share a little bit about the work you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you all so much for sharing. My name is Will Brummett. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm currently calling in from historic lands of the Piscataway and Anacostan people outside of Washington, D.C. So I actually am not with a retreat center. My day job is actually connecting. I oversee 16 different community partnerships and relationships with student activists and community nonprofits and things in the Washington, D.C. area. And so what coming to this work, I'm gonna try to attempt to share a screen. I was sort of selfishly hoping that that Brooke would go first so I can see if sharing screen works, but we'll see. Okay, here we go. But so I come into this work a little bit. I think y'all can see that. Can you see me, Aaron? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Cool. So I come into this work. First off, I think deeply grateful to have been in the presence and learned around incredible retreat centers, starting with the Highlander Research and Education Center. I do not personally I'm not like I don't go like wild when I see people like fanning over them like they're celebrities, but Alan was one of those people in my life, because Alan is a dear mentor. But working alongside the Highland Research Education Center was the first place where I learned what it meant to be in space, and be in space intentionally with activists, doing movement work all across the South and in my home Appalachia. And then afterwards, after Highlander, I had the privilege of working alongside Claudia Horowitz, who had a small retreat center for activists experiencing burnout called Stone Circles of the Stone House. That was originally located in the Medmond, Greensboro, North Carolina area. I served on their board and worked with their staff for a couple of years. I then moved to the Boston area and lived and directed the intentional community there with the Walker Center for Ecumenical Exchange. So that was the first religiously based retreat center where I lived and worked. And then now currently what I'm trying to do, and one of the reasons I'm really excited to be on the call, is the last several months I've been working alongside a Jewish community, the Amclo Jewish community, who has a sanctuary retreat property in Poolesville, Maryland, which is located about 45 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. And they are looking to begin the stewardship process of stewarding that retreat place and that land to a new group or groups who would be interested in sort of having that. And there currently are not many retreat options for activists and nonprofit movement shakers and people in the DC area. And so I'm trying to work with them to sort of cultivate what that transition could look like, and that revamp could look like. So I'm a person who actually learns through questions more than I learn through points. I love sitting with really good questions. And so when thinking about what this topic was, I just sort of sat with 4 different questions I want to sort of bring and offer to the group. And hopefully some of these will spark curiosity or consideration for you. And apologize for the memes and the GIFs as well. I do work with college students a lot, so they've taught me a thing or two about PowerPoint, and I'm like a dad and I try to add them. So apologies for that in advance. So I think the first thing I've learned working alongside and with these retreat centers is that working with community change makers, the first thing is really getting clear on what is the purpose of your space, but more importantly, like what is the world you're trying to create? And I think oftentimes retreat centers can sometimes just places like, well, we just hold space, but like, what are your retreat center really standing for and building towards? And then asking yourself who aligns with that vision and what community organizations are actually aligning with that, and also who doesn't. I think Alan spoke sort of beautifully earlier around Highlander Center, first and foremost, is sort of a place where movements are built. That is the compass, the focal point for what they're going on. And I think the reason this is important is that it not only builds connections with like-minded organizations, but when you're at a retreat center that's building towards something, you feel like you're invited in as part of that legacy and building towards that common vision versus just guests at their spot, staying in their crib or whatever it may be. But when you have a clear purpose, you're inviting people in to build with you versus simply asking people to come stay at your place. And for me, when I've seen this done well, is when organizations get really clear on what is that our purpose, what is what we're trying to create, and how do we actually articulate that and own that. And that's sort of the first question I always think about when I'm sort of thinking about first around hosting or doing something like this. The second thing is about questions around preparation. And I think for me, this is a really important aspect to name because oftentimes I think sometimes retreat centers can sometimes feel shame for all things we don't have. Like we don't have, our water sometimes is not always hot. Our meals are sometimes not always great. We don't have, ADA accessible entrances because our retreat center space was built, 85 years ago, where it may be. But I think it's really important to ask ourselves, what can our center offer within our own capacity, but also naming explicitly what can we not offer up front. So we've already heard some different things named around, okay, like what is your center staff? What is your policy around how long can folks stay? What are the financial scholarships or availability do you actually have for people to stay? What's our capacity to sponsor activists and also just let them have it and not have to have our staff around? What is our capacity and our ability to actually create and offer free resources or food, or even something as simple as like, do we have flip chart markers for folks to come and brainstorm, or do they expect to bring that? I think being as upfront and honest builds trust, because what you don't want, and I've seen it happen a couple of different times, a couple of different places, is that you come in with a set of expectations that they'll just assume that they'll need to bring all these things or do these things, and then there's a disconnect. And as soon as there's a disconnect, there's a lack of trust. And that's really hard to build back up. The best example I have for this was at the Walker Center. We sort of described it as like staying at your grandmother's cottage, but with probably better food. Because the Walker Center was like literally an old house with 20 rooms, and these were like small beds. And these weren't nice beds. It wasn't, but it was small beds. The sheets from like the 1960s. But what it was it felt homey. What the Walker Center really honed in on is that we're going to be a place for people of all faiths or no faiths in the Boston area to come and know what it means to be in space over a collective meal. And so they just named that from the very beginning. And what aligned with that is that groups came in knowing like, okay, like we have, spotty internet and no TV. So we're going to come here. We're not going to have our high-tech presentation. We're going to come here and just be in space together, have a meal together. But it allowed groups to show up fully and excitedly to be in the space as it is versus us sort of posing as something we're not. And so I think the first sort of questions is around, or second set is around preparation. The third set of questions I always ask myself is, how can we be accessible and present without overly centering ourselves? Typically, sometimes, again, this can sort of happen unintentionally, is that retreat center staff can get so excited they're like, oh my gosh, this group is here and they're doing badass work, and we want to like post it everywhere on our Instagram or Twitter, and like slow down, like don't center yourself in the relationship. But how can you just be present, but allow the group to focus on the big reasons why they're there? One place that I think did that really beautifully was Stone Circles, and under Claudia's leadership, is that as sort of staff and interns and board members, we were sort of taught how to be in space while also giving space. And so we had a lot of activists come and do silent retreats, and they had signs on them, literally just little like lanyards that said "in loving silence" the whole weekend. And we knew as a staff what that meant was to sort of give them their space to do whatever they needed to do, whether it be sleep or art or whatever it may be. But the other thing that I love about it is that what our staff did was every single dinner time, everyone did dishes. Whether you were like a nonprofit CEO with $1 million budget, or you were an activist who's 19 years old, trying to build a movement in your small rural town, everyone did dishes together. And what that allowed was that was the time of the day that everyone knew they could see staff and be around staff to ask questions, raise concerns, get those needs met. But it didn't make us overbearing with them day in and day out. So that was sort of my biggest lesson here is like being present models respect. So you know you're there for them, but not being in their space and recognizing that sometimes the space from you, while not personal whatsoever, is just what is needed. And so that's for me. So always a third set of questions is how can we be present and accessible without overly centering ourselves? And then the last set of questions I sort of go to is around parting. And with parting, I think especially this is where I think a lot of retreat centers sort of stop. And the question for me is, once a group leaves your center, that shouldn't mean they're no longer a part of your center or a part around the purpose of what you're trying to build. So for me, the questions always come up, how can a follow-up go from merely a transactional experience of, hey, here's the invoice, here's what we need you to do, to more of a transformational relationship? How are you staying in community and connection with them in a way that feels authentic and it feels grounded off your experience, but is not merely a, okay, we provided this, so you give us X, or we provided you a great time, so we need a really good quote so that we could put on our website. How can you actually really genuinely care about the relationship and the partnership? And what are spaces you can create to follow up on that? One of the things I do in my work now here in DC is I hold monthly transformational partnership calls where we literally just hold space for the partners who we met at a retreat at the beginning of the year with our partnerships. And we literally sort of say, how are they going with the question or questions they brought to that space? And it's an optional call, but it's a way for us to show we're going to be in a relationship with you outside of the one time of the year that you may actually be in space with us. And so that's one sort of example of making sure that the parting does not mean the end of the partnership. So overall, my final sort of takeaway is that from my experience, again, being really fortunate to work alongside 4 amazing retreat centers so far, is that really the keys to me for working with changemaker organizations is all about connection, trust, respect, and then forming those deep relationships. But for me, regardless of what your retreat center does or does not have, you can all ask yourself the questions around what is the purpose in the world we're trying to build? How are we preparing and letting others know what to prepare to show up fully? How can we center presence without overly centering ourselves? And then how can we part in a way that's no longer just ending the relationship, but building the partnership? And if we do some of those things or ask some of those questions, I think any retreat center would have a lot of different organizations they'd work alongside with them. So that is my connection, and that's my contact info, and I can put it in the chat too for later.
Great, thank you so much, Will. Brooke, would you like to share a little bit about the work you're doing?
And please take time for me.
Yeah, take your time, no worries.
That was amazing. And I feel like I can barely present after learning. Like, I feel like my mind is going from Ian's invitation for space and how you oriented. I feel like I just learned a ton to Will. Now you presenting on those questions. I very much want to work with you. So with that in mind, I created a PowerPoint as well. Let me see if I can make this happen. Mainly focusing on some of our local partnerships. And I really focused on sharing a little bit about what partnership with, and it's not even a capital P, but what it means to watersheds. Let me see if I can do this. Share screen. How do I'm not seeing the share screen option.
Let's see. If you go down to your bottom menu.
I see multiple participants can share simultaneously, but where do I share now?
Do you have a green button at the bottom of your screen, a menu that says?
Here we go. Sorry,
Yeah.
got it.
Yep, you're good.
let's see if I can do this. Sorry. Oh, crap. There, does that look right? Do you see it? Okay, great. So this is the Watershed Center, and we are a smaller retreat center in upstate New York, in Millerton, New York. And we are on 73 acres. We've been open for 10 years. We're about to be 10 years. And we can sleep about 40 folks. We are a social justice oriented retreat center. We definitely see ourselves as standing on the shoulders of Highlander and other retreat centers that we admire. We had big lofty visions of doing a lot of our own internal programming and have found that we really needed to focus these last 10 years on hosting in a way that really held our guests with depth and care. And we've done some programmatic work, but most of our programmatic work and offerings has come through partnership. And a lot of that partnership sort of grew organically out of our own movement connections. I would say that sort of the deepest partnership has been with what we know as the momentum-based organizing model, which informed groups like Sunrise and Cosecha. And a lot of those groups sort of came, our first retreat was the Momentum's first retreat. And out of that just grew many years of partnership where a lot of the mainly young organizers who came up through that tradition came to Watershed sometimes 20, 30 times over the last 10 years. But as you can see in this map, since we opened, a number of other organizations have joined us in not our land base, but in all the adjoining lands. So we share our land with Rocksteady Farm, which is a queer food justice project. And that's been a really beautiful partnership. Across the street then emerged the Wild Seed Community Farm. And I'm just going to go through these quickly. Our most recent neighbors are the Ancestral Heart Monastery, the Brooklyn Zen Center, who are our clients, and they bought the land right next door to us, and we've been working with them pretty closely. Sweet Freedom Farm, this is Jalal Sabor's project, which is a food justice project, and they do maple sugaring on our farm and programmatic work at times. And I would say our deepest partnership is with the First Nations in our area, which is the Schaghticoke First Nations. We've been in community with them for about 6 years, and this is one of their unity gatherings that took place at Watershed. We held many of their unity gatherings, and then we helped purchase land for them as a reparations gift nearby. So a lot of their First Nations gatherings are there. And so I came up with this sort of chart, which let me see if I can see it better. There we go. So in thinking about partnership, I feel like partnership is a sort of a vague term for us. It can mean anything from like something that actually has a contract and a real clear sense of where we're going together to an understanding that we're sort of like the retreat center, that the home base for a lot of these groups and a lot of our neighbors. And even with our neighbors, some of them were in sort of a deep sort of monthly meeting kind of partnership, and others we just literally support each other. You know, there's a massive snowstorm happening right now, and we look to support each other through whatever life needs we have. So there's a lot of breadth, and in many ways, I feel like we often feel like we should have a very clear sense of what partnership is and sort of the parameters, but for us, it's really a spectrum. So I was just putting some thought into it in preparing for this. And as I mentioned to some at the very beginning of this call, we've had some really positive, powerful partnerships, and we've also had some disastrous ones. I always find it helpful to hear a little bit about the disasters. But just in thinking about sort of broad strokes, I think that the partnerships that have gone very well for us, including the Schaghticoke would be a really good example, are ones that we've built depth with, and particularly those partnerships that have what I'm just terming breadth. That depth is really important. And so in terms of breadth, I feel like some of the key pieces in terms of like thinking about what can be complicated is when there's a bridging across culture and bridging across power. And I don't think of those things as synonymous, but obviously related. And as a white-led nonprofit space, certainly bridging across culture is present. We did a recent survey of a lot of the groups that have come through Watershed. We did some interviews, and while we do well in terms of bridging culture, we were asked to just own ourselves, even though we have lots of folks of color on our staff, that our culture is white, and just sort of like owning who we are is important. Bridging power, a lot of the groups that come to Watershed have less positional power than certainly I do as one of the founders. So really keeping that present for us, particularly when we're in partnership, which is very hard, particularly if you are the entity with greater power and greater access to all the aspects that power brings. It's hard with the blind spots. Looking at wider scope in terms of partnership that has a lot of complexity to it, longer collaborations, and frankly, the partnerships where there's been a lot of money involved, and that can be relative to the groups that we're in partnership with, what large money means, can increase this sort of complexity and the requirement for depth. And so in terms of depth, and I feel like a lot of you guys have already spoken really beautifully to what depth is, but for us, trust, transparency, clarity, love, and that's a hope, but I feel like a lot of groups that we've been in really powerful, positive relationship with, we've built real loving relationships and friendships. And reciprocity, I'm trying to remember who spoke to that. I think, Alan, you used a mutuality or a different word, but reciprocity, I think, is really important. I think that it's hard often to have a relationship that's built in one direction around either a handout or support that isn't truly mutual. And I feel like the Scaticoke for us, even though we are tremendously more resourced than a lot of the Scaticoke community, one of them, their clan mother, Alonda Snowbird Powell, is on our board. And we've found a lot of ways for there to be mutual relationship. And that, I think, has allowed for us to wander into relationship that where there has been exchange of even money in a way that's been held with a lot of beauty and openness. And that all has taken time. We've built that relationship very slowly. So stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. So that's sort of like the equation that I feel like I've never really visualized for myself, but is really important in terms of developing those relationships. And I did mention I would talk about sort of falling on our face, but we found over the years that jumping into relationships with people very quickly, particularly ones that have high degrees of complexity, has always come around to bite us. And one in particular, we had a very large donor offer us over $500,000 to build some programming at Watershed. And we brought in a community organization that we have tremendous respect for, that we had some depth to already. And they brought in another organization that's an incredible organization, but we had zero depth with. And it spectacularly fell apart due to some missteps that, had we had depth with all of those groups, we could have moved through, but we were trying to do something quickly. I think we were all excited about the $600,000. Who wouldn't be? That felt like a lot to us and a lot to the groups. But we accidentally put ourselves in the position of being gatekeepers. And we were crossing culture, crossing power, all sorts of things. And it was one of the most painful things that I've ever experienced. So learned a lot of lessons. And I've learned a lot of lessons just from listening to you. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brooke. I just got a message that Naseem is not able to join us today, so we're going to go right into our Q&A session. Ben did provide me with some questions here, but I'd love to just open up the room, and if anyone has any immediate questions or responses to anything that was shared here, feel free to speak up. Go ahead and just unmute yourself and talk, or if you feel more comfortable putting a question in the chat, feel free to go ahead and do that too, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. So we'll give it a quiet second and let people speak if they would like to speak. Sarah Urich in the chat says that she loved today's presentation. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us.
Erin, can I just add something very quickly in just following Brooke's presentation? I just also wanted to say, in terms of the things that didn't work, that there has been harm at the center, yes, to do with power and I think not overcoming mistrust. I think sometimes we talk about building trust in a way that is romantic, and in many of our communities, it's actually overcoming mistrust. And just to say that there are people who will not come back to the center. I think that the harm has been irreparable. There's been overt racism from staff members in the past. And we're in the process of repairing relationships. So I just wanted to kind of render that explicit too. I think that's a very big part of who we are now, is trying to bridge that harm, the divisiveness, and be really humble, in what we're trying to do and how we do it.
Yeah, I feel like that was a repeated theme that I've been hearing, not just in this conversation, but in previous conversations, the need for slowness and feeling your way through and not jumping in too quickly. Aaron, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Nancy. And Brooke, I always appreciate you talking about the things that didn't work. I feel like it's also I don't want to say it's endemic. It's just a culture of like, yeah, we're great. Like nonprofits always need to be great and always need to be doing great stuff. And I'm like, everybody's great. Why haven't we figured this out yet? And one of the things that I think Wild Seed sits a lot with is even when there's trust and a lot of love, when you ask people to do something that they haven't done and that there's no guarantee it will work, like leaving capitalism, people somatically freak out, right? Like most of us got really good in a system that wasn't good for us. And a thing I think we don't talk a lot about is like when you go into that other space, there's a lot of things about certainty, fairness, connection, belonging, but also like status that we don't have alternatives for. And I think that's one of the real struggles is you can have people who are very dedicated, even people who don't come from it from ego, and then you step out onto this limb of anti-capitalism or anti-patriarchy or anti-racism, and you're like, oh, well, I didn't realize how much of my sense of safety was actually being this smart Black dude. And I internalized this thing in elementary school that if you're an average Black person, you will be overlooked. And to be overlooked as the Black person is to be cast aside. And to be cast aside in America is to be vulnerable to death, right? And that is a thing that I really feel like is an unspoken problem in social movements, and something that retreat space and sabbatical offers up a potentiality for people to sit in that, in a space where like food and housing is like cared for, so you can just focus on this thing. Because I've seen it's really hard to do when you also have to, you know, pay your taxes and watch your kids and clean yourself and clean your room and figure out what's for dinner. You know, like one of those things always goes away. And so that I also want to just put up there as a place that Wild Seeds is exploring, because we've seen in places where, to use Brooke language, we had both depth and breadth and trust, it falls apart because things that people didn't even think to bring up with their therapist came up when they were put in new situations.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you,
I think what-
Betsy. I was just going to say, Betsy made a little comment in the chat that she's part of a new Center for Spirituality emerging in Northern Michigan, and that this chat has been very helpful. Thank you, Betsy.
One of my encounters with the world of retreat centers, and I think yeah, to a certain extent with Highlander, has been just like a deep temptation to try to be everything to everybody, rather than like a real clarifying discernment about who the organization, entity, center, people who make it up are. I think like Will's point about purpose, among the deeper versions. I mean, I've worked with a couple of Methodist institutions, for example. And no shade to the Methodists. I love Methodist people. Some of my best friends are Methodist. But I think some of the things that I see as kind of complicated with some of the areas in like church-based work is like there's a way to be radically Christian and radically particularly Christian and be in right relationship, right? Like there's a way to not erase the complexities of the imperial Christian identity, or not ignore it, not try to gloss over it, while also still going deep into the well of the traditions and the cultural strategies that are possible because of that. And I feel like what some of the things that I've seen in terms of bridging gaps and the complications of bridging gaps between retreat centers and communities is like not really a willingness to not go deep on what is possible when that is when that's recognized or when that's dug into and therefore leveraged, right? Like how, or even to like work with your own folks, you know, it's some of that old and I still think important language is like work with your own people and kind of organize your own, not at the exclusion or out of reliance or relationship with, but it's like one of the things I've appreciated about even this collaborative, I haven't participated as much in the last couple of years, but I just think, you know, building a political home for people who run this stuff, but then at the particular location, organizing Christians, you know, if it's a Christian-based organization, like organizing Christians, like finding your lane around these traditions that aren't going to go away, you know, they're just going to turn into something else, and they are turning into something else, like the emerging churches and that are there. And so the temptation to kind of erase our identities because we feel bad about what they did, I think leads to missed opportunities to leverage the best of our cultural strategies and our cultures. So
This is sort of a question that I have. And I don't know, this is kind of like something that I kind of, I talk to a lot of people I'm close with, and I've never sort of voiced in a group, but I'm curious, particularly for you all, Erin and Ayan, I'm saying her name wrong now. Ayin, sorry, got it, Ayin. Just from looking at your websites, offering support to folks. And it's, I'm coming from a very privileged background personally, and Watershed was seeded by me and the wealth that I inherited. So I feel like I'm saying this from a place where this feels true sometimes just in my life in general. But I found, retreat centers are very tricky because they offer people the illusion of stepping out of all of the isms that you were mentioning, Erin, and nobody is, and some of us don't try as hard. I mean, you guys are putting a hell of a lot of effort into creating something that's outside of the isms. We sort of, there's only so much we can do given our model at the moment. But I have found that when we invite people to either have free retreats, like where there's no reciprocity, and free can mean like no, even doing dishes is reciprocity, but like zero reciprocity as a gift, even because with an acknowledgement of like how important the work that the person is doing or the organization is doing. Sometimes I've found that to blow up. And the way that I've made sense of it, and again, this is the part that I don't really share much about, but I'd be curious with this group, is that it's more comfortable for people to be in resentment than to feel indebted. And I feel like that's a part of capitalism. Again, that's like stuff that we're like, the sense that if you're given anything that there is an indebtedness because capitalism indoctrinates us in the way that we do. But in part, that's why I sometimes am wary when, even for friends of mine who are running organizations that are BIPOC led or that are frontline led, I've even seen that at times get really ugly. And in some ways I see it, the more the gift, the greater the actual like gift with a capital G, the uglier it can get, which can feel really confusing and really demoralizing. And I'm just curious if anyone else has sort of run into that.
Oh yeah, we run into that all the time. A big part of our practice was give money to people first. And our biggest blow up was that we wanted to start paying people before they'd figured out what their contribution or job to the collective was. And I was blindsided by like an actual multi-year friendship that broke up. Like we had unionized the shop together. We had dealt through racism. We had like had each other's back fighting against like white male dominated unions. And it was like in some part, paying her without needing something from her was the thing that like blew up our friendship. And I think I've read a lot about it, and I think I'm a big believer in a gift economy as the sort of like basis of it. And I think that the part about the gift economy we don't talk about is it turned into hierarchy because people would use debt. And like honestly, like one of the ways that slavery comes about in societies is that you give a gift so big that the other person can never return it, and that actually puts them perpetually in your debt. And I think there is something deep that we've all internalized, that if you get so far into people's debt, it gives them power over you. And that desire to be like, no, we just have resources and we can't give them without stressing ourselves out. So we should give them, is met with that contradiction of, but that gives you power over me. And yeah, I guess I'd say we've seen that and we're struggling with it. And I do not have an answer to what to do other than what we've done is taken the gift back and asked people what the gift they could take from us. And I know I've had to work on like, ooh, it feels like you're throwing my generosity here. And then we're just falling back into capitalism because it's easier. And I've had to work through my own stuff that comes up with doing that. But yeah, just I guess the cosign, it's real.
Yeah, I so love this question, and want to just thank all the presenters because it's so great. I learned so much just being in this conversation. I will say we have a practice where we cover up to $1,000 transportation grants and up to $1,250 back home grants, childcare, elder care, pet care, whatever. And we've actually shaped it as a collective community practice to say, take what you need, but not if you don't, right? To really invite people into their own inquiry of what's needed, right? In addition to sort of saying, if you own your own home and you're going to get an inheritance, consider that in terms of what you're asking for, but also being explicit, like with transportation, we're saying, come the night before, get snacks at the airport, get extra, right? Like it is about abundance, and generosity is what's underflowing everything that we do. So, I think back to what you were naming, Brooke, around the trust piece, right? We work with leaders as opposed to organizations, because I'm clear that organizations are the site of actually a lot of trauma for our leaders. And I'm interested in folks who are advancing justice wherever they are, and that's going to change in 5 years or 6 months or 10 years or whatever. So we're more interested in the leaders in particular. And so, I think that gives us an opportunity to be building trust with actual people. But I will also say we do a lot of open houses where we have a conversation about exactly who we are and who we aren't. And then we have the intro 3 coaching sessions that I shared about when folks are already in the village, but how do we come together and be in conversation and be in relationship? And none of this is to say that's a solution, but these are just some of the tools that we've tried, because our whole residency is complementary. But we also ask for an exchange of like, what is your feedback for us? That's a part of our energetic exchange. Like, we want you to stay connected with others in this cohort and village. That's the energetic exchange. So not money, but we are listening for always like where folks' energy is and how it's showing up throughout our onboarding process, as a way to create access points. And we're thinking now about the assumptions that we hold at each of those access points around what's possible for folks. And, I'll just say I'm part of this other group called Jubilee Gift, and we really are like reimagining money as sacred, and in a deep conversation about money is just a tool, is just energy. How do we really lean into what is gifting, right? And in the guise or not under the framework of who do I need to be so you can be who you are, right? Like actual gift, not philanthropic gift, right? Which is a whole other power dynamic. So, but love the inquiry, more to come, right?
Yeah, so many great insights here. Thank you everyone for sharing. We're getting close to time, but there's still a little bit more time if anyone has any additional thoughts or questions that they'd like to share.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I want to share is we've been experimenting a lot with trying to present ourselves and talking about Wild Seed not as a space in which racism and patriarchy don't exist, but a space in which we all agree to get at it and try and abolish it together. That it's a space where we put resources to give people the conditions in which that's possible in a human way. But I think that sometimes we set people up to think, oh, this is the movement, and so these things shouldn't be here. And it's like, well, no, I mean, we're from a racist society, so we're going to bring it with us. Like, that's the fallacy of settler colonialism, is that there's ever a blank slate where you can just build something that has no relationship to what became before. Yeah.
I have a question for the group. I'm with Bethlehem Center on Vancouver Island in Canada, and it's an organization that has been around for 35 years. But over the last 7 years, we've really been in transformation, I will say, because the society that now leads the organization is in different hands. But we definitely are toddlers in our culture and in, you know, like as an example, like I think we've had our DEI statements defined within the last 6 months. So really, you know, just starting out. And Nancy, it was interesting because right now we're having lots of conversation about the cross that's on our chapel as it exists, because knowing, you know, just what triggers are and creating safe spaces, we have so much work to do, and a lot of our board is still a foundational board, so lots of old school way of thinking, and you know, there's a willingness, but maybe not the awareness and to really enter into where we are. So we've got a long way to go. So I just out to the group, like if you think about an organization that's at that toddling stages, you know, if you have any advice. I'm the executive director here, and we are starting to bridge into some really cool opportunities with partnerships. But hearing, you know, Brooke, you talk about, you know, the slowness and cautiousness that's needed around those relationships, especially if we are, you know, very much right now a white dominated organization. So, you know, how do we take those baby steps, and what would be some of your words of wisdom?
Something I would say is really looking at how to get racialized folks, frankly, and a real diversity in your power, in your decision making. Like we're still working on that, and this conversation about money and you know, we're having conversations about like, is compensation something that we want to do for board members? You know, for example, it's a kind of a bit of a heated conversation we're having, but it's fascinating. But I'm the first racialized ED at the center, and even things as simple as we used to have bursaries where someone was gatekeeping whether or not you deserve, you know, to have funding. And now we do it much more around, you know, if here's the true cost of this program. Anyway, I'm getting sidelined, but I actually think whatever it means in your context, in your communities, to have more voices, different lived experiences at the table with real decision-making power is essential, however that can happen.
Thank you.
I might agree with that, and also caution that we've done harm to folks when we've brought them into the table. Like even that requires time and trust building and real deep searching. I've tokenized people on our staff before and very much harmed the organization in doing that, not only just created harm to them and to others. So, you know, and I think that is a tendency of just to like look for a person of color who may possibly fit the job description just to feel better about yourself. And I don't think there's been times where I have not been ready to do that bridging and getting the support that you need to be able to do that bridging, so you're not harming people in the process. And yes, that is creating power structures that aren't white led is really important, but there's a road to getting there, I would say, unless you're just going to turn the keys over, which is another option. But sometimes even that can create harm, because sometimes if you turn over, you know, we've thought many times, oh, you know, certainly in the past, what if we just gave watershed to the Schaghticoke, who are very dear to us, and we know that would actually cause harm. And it feels very paternalistic to say, but we've, you know, had open discussions with them. It would cause harm to their community in this moment in their evolution. And it's a yucky mess that a lot of my forefathers have put us into.
We've got a comment in the chat too from Jenying Wu, who says, an essential part of the new I've found that requires moving into and through the isms versus bypassing them. In my work to disempower them by normalizing talking about them in safe, brave spaces or circles that names harm and co-creates healing.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah. And we are just about at time, or we are at time, it looks like. So I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you to everyone who shared today. This was such a rich conversation. I learned so much, and I hope everyone else did too. I hope we can continue to have more conversations like this going into the future. Registration for our annual retreat will be up in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And our next community call is March 28th. Brenda Salgado will be facilitating a Rachel healing workshop called Reconciling Trauma in the Body with Trauma in the Land. So I hope you'll all join us for that. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.